2 years on from Humankind's initial release, how does this 4X historical strategy game stand up against the great Civilization VI? Humankind was initially touted by some as a Civilization VI killer, yet of course the two games present themselves in a very different way. Sit back and relax, and this video we're going to take a look at the journey of Humankind over 2 years. How has it changed? Does it provide more value now? And how does it stack up against the behemoth that is Civ 6? I'm JumboPixel, let's jump straight in. Now, Humankind, of course, is a different game and also a very similar game at the same time. It's a bit of a dichotomy, but one example might be the fame system, the era stars, how you're rewarded for different parts of your journey, your growth or expansion, to get victory. Or, of course, we could say, well, actually, Civ 6 is really the only truly historical one because it has proper historical leaders. Where, of course, Humankind, with its very different systems, by the way, for trade and diplomacy, takes a more customizable approach. And then there's combat, which, as we'll see throughout this video, of course, plays very differently in Humankind than it does in Civilization VI, a now some 6-year-old game. Yet, of course, as we look at the map, we see hexes with resource yields, and when we look up the top and around the sides, we see a UI that looks fairly similar, with yields growing, cities developing, and all kinds of other similarities between the two. Now let's jump into the detail. So in this video, I'm going to take you through basically 3 different layers. Firstly, we're going to look at the community around Humankind, from the development and challenges to player counts. Those are particularly interesting. Then we'll move through to look at game updates that have been free. How has the game actually changed for you and I, people who may have bought it or have access to it? And then finally, we'll look at the paid expansion of Humankind. And the best place to start is to take a look at the player numbers, because this gives us a feel of what we're actually dealing with here. Humankind, as you can see, peaked at 55,000 players on release and now sits between 1,000 and 2,000. And actually that trend tends to hold. If we look over the course of a year, you can see it doesn't really get above 4,000 players in any given measured period. Now, if we take a look over a lifetime, it really paints the full picture. Huge surge on release, and then the world's scariest water slide you've ever been on, cruising down to the low thousands. A minor blip with a DLC release earlier this year, but otherwise pretty consistent. Now, what are we actually comparing it to? Well, of course, we should probably look to Civilization VI as the king in this space. And as you can see, it very much is. 55,000 active players, about 60 or 70 as its daily peak. And honestly, this trend that Civilization is showing in comparison to Humankind holds true throughout the entire thing. Probably the scariest graph of all is this one. The lifetime player count for Civilization VI is scarily impressive. Yes, it dipped, it fell down to about 25,000, nowhere near as significant of a decline, but it rose over time. And now, there's a shitload of people playing Civ 6 years later. Speaking of years later, even Civilization 5 holds up pretty well, actually, with around 10 to 20,000 players a day. And of course, that's just us looking at the Steam numbers. That's just one metric. Civilization 6 has many, many more metrics available to it because it's on console. So clearly, Humankind is nowhere near as popular as Civilization 6. And that's the conclusion that we can reach from looking at that. A community isn't simply bound by a number of players, though, and nor are they necessarily a measure that a game is good or bad, though they probably tend to reflect it. We should also consider the role of the development team. They're really active on the forums. There's loads of different things that they talk about there, not just from like how to improve the game, but also in-game events, these kind of regular challenges that they tend to release around once a month. They used to be quite fantastical. Now they're more sort of scenario map-based challenges, but whatever they are, I think that they do play a role in keeping things a little bit fresh for regular players and showing that there's still support behind this big beast, that it's not being dumped like a Paradox title that didn't do well. Player counts do matter for other things, though. They matter for things like the modding community, which, by the way, there are some absolutely brilliant mods. We've covered many of them here on the channel. The modding community will shrink over time if there are less players. That's just kind of straightforward. They have less incentive to create mods because fewer people will be engaging and using the content that they've worked so hard to make. And of course, in general, there'll be less creators around it. Now, All of that comes together, I think, to paint kind of a mixed picture for Humankind. Is it a more active development community than Civ 6? Well, absolutely. Civilization 6 hasn't received a free update of any significance in a really long time. We believe it's done with its DLC, although it continues to be a success, gaining more daily players than it had last year and the year before, so maybe Civilization 6 can actually keep going for a bit longer. On the flip side, though, it's also pretty obvious that Humankind is nowhere near as popular in terms of regular player counts, and that will have flow-on effects onto what kinds of opportunities and content and community development that Humankind might see in future. On to Chapter 2. Here in the body of the video, we're talking about game updates. How has Humankind changed over time? And specifically here, I'm talking about the second year of Humankind's development, from August 2022 through to July 2023, because this is the stuff that I haven't encapsulated in a full video like I did a year ago. Firstly, the anniversary update came out on the 17th of August 2022, and to be honest, there were 4 main updates in this calendar year, or this Humankind year, should I say. This was one of them, and it didn't really do much. As you can see, it's a bit of a funsies update. They added some cosmetics around celebrating their first birthday for the most part. That was kind of it. So out of the 4 updates that have released since the last time I did this kind of video, one of them wasn't really a whole lot. However, of course, the number of updates don't necessarily reflect the quality of the changes. One big significant update could do more than 12 that do basically bugger all. So let's take a look at the next one. Coming in second was the Metternich update. It came out on the 9th of November 2022, and it focused around a new stealth system, around third-party reinforcement to reinforce our allies in battle. There was also a new independent people system. We can sign treaties with them now, exchange a bit of our influence, a bit of our money, and in exchange get extra deals out of them. Maybe you get some of their yield. Eventually you can build up to having them as a client state. This one was probably the most significant change, and to be honest, it could be one of my favorite free changes that Humankind has received ever. I would add a caveat here, though, that of course all of this came out to support the release of a paid expansion pack, which of course we'll touch on in the next chapter of the video. These changes were, of course, absolutely free, but they were really supporting a wider diplomacy expansion, and that's why they were there. However, the why doesn't matter so much. To reflect on this update, I thought it was a really punchy one. I thought most of the changes were fairly well received. Definitely still some work to do, and even around some of my favorite changes, like the city-states, the barbarian cities as I sometimes call them, maybe there could have been more there, more uniqueness to each one, a unique resource, a unique unit, something to distinguish them from one another. The next update that we saw, the first one for 2023, was the Shackleton update. Came out right around the start of the year, actually. These two were fairly close together. This one was more about sort of stepping back and taking stock, in my opinion anyway. Here it was about the UI. It was about changes and balance changes to certain cultural affinity abilities that may have been just a little bit more powerful than others. Of course, balance has been a long-standing issue for Humankind. It was one of the main critiques when the game first came out, and I think that patches just like this one and many others have made good progress in fixing Humankind's balance as much as you can in a game with literally over a million, tens of millions of combinations of cultures. And after the Shackleton update came the final update for Humankind's second year, the Vauban update. The Vauban update sort of reminds me of the second one, the Metternich update, in many ways, because it was more of a feature-rich update, rather than fixing things or rebalancing things. Here we saw finally Steam Workshop support, the mods in Humankind, some fairly significant AI improvements, and they demonstrated just how significant they were in it managing faith and influence and early expansion in particular, and on faster game speeds. It's a bit more competitive now too. So I'm pleased to report that, at least in my experience, the AI is better. I found, in fact, it could maybe even be roughly one difficulty level better. That would be probably at the higher end of its improvements. I don't want to try and oversell it here or anything, but it definitely has improved. The update also saw really much needed changes to things like auto-resolve battles. They made improvements. You can now preview damage, demand renounce all buttons for the diplomacy screen, and a new cultural wonder as well. Because of course we also received paid DLC, Wonders update, the Parabellum pack for Humankind, which we'll talk about a little bit in the next chapter. And of course, they still have plenty of work to do. Now, the roadmap for Humankind was frustratingly lacking in detail, most likely for anybody looking at it. But I do think that the future development of Humankind still has fixes to be made, still has work to do. There are many things that we could talk about here. I'm not going to jump into each and every single one of them, but in particular, I think that some stability improvements, particularly around multiplayer, really could and perhaps should have been implemented by now, though I would note that strategy game multiplayer is notoriously, at least for me, not really accustomed to working very well, or at least not all of the time. The self-identified issues, the most pressing ones at least from the roadmap, and they've talked about it a little bit in updates or live streams since, that we still really need to see action on are things like trade and the trade system. Naval units, how they operate, the kind of world that they're moving in, as well as quality of life improvements and other things. Like I say, continued optimization, continued balance improvements potentially, although there have been less of those in previous months, I would note. The other thing, of course, that we could look at is the forums, the amplifiers, games together, whatever it's called these days, doesn't really matter. There's a list of greenlit projects, most of them, of course, focusing on things like trade. Piracy, things like UI improvements. Now, these are all community-submitted ideas that have been greenlit. The developers have said, yep, we're going to do this. There's also some must-haves and other categories you could take a look through if you were interested in checking it out. I like how active they are in responding to stuff there as well. It's really great to see that. Now, that's sort of the known problems and the future changes that we should expect. So now we have quite a good idea about where Humankind stands, the progress that it's made, particularly in the calendar year of its second year, I should say. And then we've now kind of left with one final piece of this puzzle. What about the paid expansion? The kind of thing that might be helping to support future development of Humankind. Maybe there's some imperative notion of success there that we need to try and reach. Let's take a look at Chapter 3, the paid expansion of Humankind. This one's a really difficult one. Some upsides, some downsides. Let's take a look. Firstly, there are two main DLCs that are worth about $10 or more. The Together We Rule, classified as a proper expansion, came out in November 2022. And then an additional culture pack, like the Cultures of Africa, this time Latin America, released in June of 2022, adding about 6 new cultures and associated buildings and wonders. That one fairly straightforward. I consider those culture packs to be nice to have. They're fairly cheap. I'll always get them, but you don't really need them necessarily. They don't add any new features that you'd be missing out on. However, the Together We Rule, technically, expansion does, and it's obviously more costly as well, about $25. It adds embassies, these way to build ties with other nations and gain access to their units, engage in treaties, cooperation, exchange resources, that kind of thing. It also added new units, these sort of spies, these agents, and overall there was a Congress of Humankind, sort of a global theater for maybe diffusing a conflict, maybe settling a disagreement around civics and kind of global ideologies, if you will, but a very sort of soft version of that. And some new cultures, new wonders, that more flavorful stuff. I would note the new type, because there was also a brand new type of culture, the diplomatic cultures added into Humankind, not particularly impressive, a little bit underwhelming out the gate. So in Humankind's second calendar year, it saw the first major expansion. I won't touch on every single little thing, like last time I didn't talk about music packs, but it's important to also note, as I mentioned earlier, with the last free update for Humankind's second year, also came another expansion, a small sort of $3 to $5 wonder pack. Again, another flavorful option that you could choose to add. I think they're all fairly fun. I also think that probably the DLC isn't needed for most players. If you play a lot of Humankind, of course you should get it. But if you're perhaps thinking about buying Humankind, shifting over from Civilization 6 or whatever else, it might not be worth picking up that DLC straight away. On sale, great deal. Full price, you could maybe take it or leave it. Some of the mechanics do feel a little bit tedious to me. The leverage mechanic, where you can kind of pick up this extra currency by walking around the map and finding enemy cities to put a diplomat in or areas of interest. And then you spend that currency to maybe lower the opponent's war support or something like that. Really fun in practice, like a great idea, but a little bit tedious, adds lots of extra clicking, and sometimes doesn't quite feel like I'm really getting much from it. That being said, the new sort of suzerain system, if we could call it that, the system of treaties with independent peoples, the stealth system, where stealth can basically expire if a unit's being looked at by a lot of others, to put it really simply, spies, embassies, I think all of that stuff is great and quite a nice addition to Humankind. So don't get me wrong, a reasonable year for paid expansions in Humankind. Its second year, I expected an expansion. Indeed, Civilization 6 delivered one in its second year. Maybe not its most successful one, but it did. And Humankind has largely, I would argue, achieved the same. Fewer updates than in its first year, but still reasonable changes being rolled out and from a very active development team. Now, I'm going to level with you. I've called this section paid expansion because there's another realm here. How does Humankind expand into new markets, reach new players? Here specifically, of course, we're talking about console. And during Humankind's second year, the console release for Humankind on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, and the newest Xboxes was delayed indefinitely, i.e. until we update you again. No timeline as to when, no real information as to what or why. Could be commercial reasons, of course, behind that. And I'm not sure why, because let's be real, I'm going to play Humankind on my computer with a mouse and keyboard, even if there's a console version. So it doesn't affect me personally, but for whatever reason, I felt like this was particularly disappointing. It was disappointing to see what felt to me, and maybe this is moving a little bit too far away from the objective side and more into the feeling side, but it felt a bit like another big blow, a big letdown, even though I wasn't personally interested. I'd be interested to know your thoughts below. Obviously, there are many positive benefits that could come from Humankind being released onto more platforms, most notably, though, relating right back to that stuff we talked about at the start, to pulling in a greater community. More people in the community will mean more content for you to watch, more people making content, more people playing Humankind, more multiplayer, and likely more attention from the devs, right? It all, of course, comes back ultimately to a player base, a community, and, of course, let's be real, to sales as well, because ultimately money does need to be flowing into a system. That will round out Chapter 3 here. The only other final thing to note, I guess, is that you can play Humankind on Game Pass, although it's only Game Pass for PC. Obviously, it's not available on console, but if you'd like to try it out for free, that'd be a great idea. I also would quickly note that in the last Steam sale, it was 80% off. The first time we've seen really big, significant discounts for Humankind. So, could be worth, in fact, almost certainly worth, actually, let me rephrase that and be really clear, definitely worth a buy at that level of discount. Now I'm going to move through to what is effectively a cheeky fourth chapter. I'd like to thank you if you're still watching for watching through all this way. YouTube loves a watch time. Now let's bring it all in. My conclusions. What do I think and feel, and what have we talked about? How can I sort of quickly package this up with 2 minutes of your time? I think that Humankind has had, on balance, pretty successful second year in keeping with the foundations that it laid in the first. It hasn't really markedly done anything different. The only exception could be that we saw the first major expansion pack, right? The first major paid DLC. Outside of that, there were big patch updates that were great to see with reasonable improvements to the strength of the AI, the balance of units, so on and so forth, although there were fewer than in Humankind's first year. And overall, we saw the community, level of community activity, development around the game stay roughly the same, roughly consistent with what it experienced in its first year. Now, this is both, of course, good and bad news. If you're a fan of Humankind, you'll likely want to see the game and the community growing faster, growing at all. But on the other side, the game is still being supported. Like I joked at earlier, it hasn't been given the ditch like I'm sure you can think of many games that have. Given it had quite a mixed review, let's not forget, Humankind debuted at around, I think, 50 or 60% positive reviews on Steam. Many criticisms around balance, strength of the AI, the game simply not working, the end of turn glitch that I'm grateful to say I haven't personally encountered in a very long time, and the nuke glitch, which was also a really frustrating one at the start of the game that is no longer an issue. So really good progress has been made on Humankind, I can say that comfortably, but I could also say that it wasn't really completely inspirational. I think the indefinite delay of the console version of Humankind was a bit of a blow to that inspiration, to that feeling, that kind of hype around the expansion and growth of the game. But also, we have seen plenty of free and paid expansions and growth in the game. So as a player, I would confidently say that there hasn't been a better time to play Humankind than right now. And to call back right to the start, was Humankind the Civ 6 killer 2 years on? No, clearly not. Although, of course, when we say that, we're sort of speaking a little bit hyperbolically, aren't we? What we're really saying is these two games are similar and will compete for our attention. If one was able to truly knock out the other, that would be very impressive. And if anyone was able to, you might argue that Civilization 6 has taken the kingpin spot really that it's always held in 4X strategy gaming, historical in particular. Thank you for joining me. Please don't forget to leave a like on the way out. These kind of videos take a lot of editing and research. I'll see you all next time.